This episode is brought to you by Vaulted. Launched by McIlvaney Financial Group, with Vaulted, I literally just tap a button and bam, I own physical gold stored in a professional vault. I can also take delivery at any time, extremely simple and less expensive than any other method. The do-it-yourself way to buy precious metals. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to vaulted.blbvux.net/coffeeandamike. I mean, look at how easy this is. The Vaulted app on my phone, I can access it at any time. Ron, been too long since you and I have spoken, and I appreciate you coming back. Thank you.
Oh, great to be here.
I want to start off. My first question to you is, you have not, in the short time that I've known you, and I think we've spoken now 5, 6, 7 times since I started this, and you're somebody that's not, you don't shy away from very, I would say, radioactive topics, and since from the get-go, you didn't shy away from it. I know people that will not touch certain things, and one of those is Israel, Gaza, Palestine. They just won't do it. So why is it you've never stayed away from it?
Well, again, I mean, these are important topics. And I mean, it could be, for example, many of the people you're talking about might be very active on social media. So perhaps they're scared of being banned from, the social media sites that they've invested a lot of effort in. Or, it could be, for example, that they survive on donations and they're very worried about being cut off in that sort of way. But, I am really not so much impacted by those things. I'm not very active on social media. I don't really use social media. So, I just sort of go ahead and, investigate things and write about things that I feel, are important. I mean, the motto of our website, the UNS Review, is, the fact that we provide a platform for important, controversial ideas that have been excluded from the mainstream media. And that's exactly the sort of thing that, I often write about.
Have you ever experienced any backlash to the point where it's, threats or anything of that nature because of talking about some of these things?
No, not really. I mean, the thing to remember is about a dozen years ago, I'd been the publisher of the American Conservative. And as I started to write about, not issues as controversial as this, but some controversial issues, I ended up getting purged from that publication. So that's the whole reason I originally set up the UNS Review as my own website. So I'd have a venue for my own writings rather than being under, the control of some other group that, could kick me off or purge me or something like that.
So that forever changed you. You never wanted to be at the mercy of somebody else.
Exactly.
So, October 7th, it seems like so long ago now, because we're coming up on, what are we at, 2.5 years since that happened?
Sure.
So 2.5 years, and how much has changed since then, and domestically, what's occurring in the United States? What are your thoughts on, from that time, because you and I spoke was shortly after, and we've had, conversations in between, but are you surprised where things are right now in the United States in relation to tying back to October 7th?
Well, I mean, obviously, most people didn't expect the Middle East sort of war, the Israeli attack on Gaza to last remotely this long. People mostly thought it would be a few weeks or something like that. Instead, it really has become the basis for the possibility of a much broader Middle Eastern war. For example, there are some indications right now that America might be getting close to attacking Iran, or at least that Trump is threatening to do that. And there are also, some, views that Israel might attack Iran, and, it even could, suck in Russia or China. So, I mean, there is certainly the possibility of a much broader Middle Eastern war now, that was sparked, obviously, by the original Hamas attack on October 7th. And, obviously, to the extent that the Middle East conflict has gone on so much longer than people expected and become so much of a broader conflict, that has impacted American society in ways that nobody would have expected at the time. And, that's actually part of what I'm obviously discussing in my latest article. The fact that there's been such a severe crackdown on America's top institutions of higher education. I mean, Harvard, Columbia, Penn, a lot of our top universities have now been subjected to very severe government crackdowns under the Trump administration. And, again, many of the students there, for example, apparently Secretary of State Marco Rubio has already canceled the visas and green cards of 300 foreign students at those elite universities. And, the police or federal agents have been sent out to sort of track them down and deport them, which, something that really has never happened in American society before to this extent. So, it's becoming a much broader issue, I think, in American society right now than anybody would have expected when the fighting first broke out, as you said, a couple of years ago.
Well, and I watched Marco Rubio's, I've watched him in a couple of different press conferences taking questions in regards to that. And he made it clear, if you read an op-ed, we're not going to, if you're vandalizing or breaking the law, we're going to deport you. Now, in your article that you put out this morning, which I encourage people to go, is the audio attached to it this morning? I was reading.
Sorry?
Is your audio attached to it this morning
Sure,
too?
exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I was reading it. But I encourage people to read, and if not to read, to listen to Ron. But you were talking about a student who apparently just wrote an op-ed that was grabbed and deported?
Oh, exactly. I mean, that's happening to a lot of students. In other words, none of these students are accused of any, serious crimes or anything like that. They're all being rounded up simply because of, things that they wrote or their participation in some protest actions, but, very minor sort of protests. I mean, the thing that really got a lot of people's attention was there was a Tufts student who was simply walking in the early evening to a holiday dinner at a friend's house. And she was suddenly grabbed by 6 federal agents, hustled into a van, and then taken off to, I think she was actually taken to a holding cell in Louisiana for deportation. And at least based on, what I read in the New York Times and the other publications, the only charges against her was that she'd written an op-ed in the Tufts campus newspaper, co-authored an op-ed about a year ago, criticizing Israel's attack on Gaza. So another end, she basically had a green card, or actually she had a student visa, while some of the other people have had green cards. And, we're talking about really the most severe crackdown on freedom of speech in American society, I think probably we've ever seen. In other words, nothing like this happened during the 1950s, nothing certainly in the 1960s. Possibly some similar things may have happened in the 1920s, 100 years ago. But that was in the aftermath of a wave of terrorist bombings all across the United States and attempts to assassinate top government officials. While here we're talking about, for example, a student co-authoring an op-ed in her Tufts newspaper, which called for nothing illegal, nothing, improper in any way. And in fact, I think I haven't actually looked at the op-ed yet, but somebody posted it. All she was saying is that the students at her school had voted overwhelmingly to encourage the administration to divest from companies doing business with Israel. And the administration therefore refused to follow the vote of the student body on that issue. And she simply encouraged the administration to follow the votes of the students on divestiture. So, I mean, we're talking about a very innocuous sort of statement. And a year later, suddenly she was grabbed by, she was, again, just walking on the streets of, I think it was Somerville, Boston area town, grabbed by 6 federal agents, masked federal agents, and hustled off to a waiting van. I mean, as far as I know, nothing like that has ever happened in American society before. In fact, the ironic analogy I used, was everybody's familiar, for example, with the Rosenbergs, who were arrested because they were part of a Soviet spy ring in the 1950s that stole our nuclear weapons secrets and gave them to Stalin, gave them to Soviet Union. And, they ended up being executed for their involvement in nuclear espionage. But when they were arrested, as far as I know, just a couple of FBI men came to their, house or office and simply took them into custody, as just anybody would normally be arrested. Well, in this case, a girl who'd simply written an op-ed for a student newspaper was grabbed by six masked federal agents as she was walking on the streets of her city. And in fact, she was held incommunicado for the first 24 hours so that, none of her friends or relatives or lawyers even had access to her. I mean, that's basically something out of, a Hollywood movie about a police state. And, we're talking about just a very, very strange development in American society. And I haven't really followed, I don't watch TV, so I didn't watch, for example, Rubio's press conference or anything like that. But I've seen clips of it. And certainly I've seen descriptions of what he said in various articles, like an article by CBS, the New York Times, that sort of thing. And what he basically said is they've already canceled the visas and green cards of 300 students. Now, when somebody has a green card, they're a permanent resident of the United States. And according to, standard law, they have all the same rights and privileges of any American citizen. In other words, they're covered by the Bill of Rights, they're covered by the First Amendment, they're covered by all of those provisions. And the only time people's green cards are ever canceled is if they commit a very serious legal offense like murder or rape or something like that. And instead, all of these individuals' green cards, their permanent residency, have been canceled simply because they criticize the government of Israel, which is just astonishing. Again, nothing like that has ever happened in American society before. And the argument that Rubio, I believe, made was that one of America's foremost policy objectives is to combat anti-Semitism around the world. And by criticizing the state of Israel, they are therefore interfering with an American government objective, and therefore their permanent residency was canceled, and they were rounded up in police raids, which is just, very, very bizarre. I mean, again, nothing like that has ever happened in American society before. And the thing about it is, many of these same arguments could obviously be applied to full-fledged American citizens as well. In other words, if an American citizen criticizes the government of Israel, he's arguably interfering with that same policy objective of the American government. And in fact, I think one of the accusations made against some of these people is by criticizing the government of Israel, they're lending material support to Israel's enemies like Hamas, which is a officially designated terrorist organization by the United States. But it seems to me if any American citizen criticized the government of Israel, the government could argue that they're similarly lending material support or maybe immaterial support to a terrorist organization like Hamas, which also criticizes the government of Israel. I mean, we're talking about something so bizarre that if anything like this had happened, the notion of six masked federal agents abducting a young college student who was walking the streets of her city on her way to a dinner party simply because of an op-ed she'd written in her student newspaper a year ago. I mean, that's something that is so bizarre. If it happened in any other country around the world that America was hostile towards, if it happened in Russia, if it happened in China, if it happened in Iran, it would become the centerpiece of a full-fledged American propaganda campaign showing the entire world what it means when you live in a country that has no freedom of speech, no First Amendment, no Bill of Rights. And yet it's happening in the United States. In fact, it's happened now to, probably a couple of hundred people. Now, there was another case, for example, of a young Korean, South Korean student whose family had come to the United States about 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, they'd come here and she'd actually never gotten her citizenships, but she had full, legal residency status. She was a valedictorian and was a junior at Columbia. And the police raided her building because of her, criticism of Israel. And so she'd gone into hiding. She's now in hiding right now to avoid having the police catch her, arrest her, and deport her to South Korea, a country that she's never lived in since she was, I think, 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And I mean, we're talking about things that are so bizarre that one of the main assets America has on the geopolitical stage is the fact that our universities are considered so attractive to the best and the brightest, the elite students from around the world who come here to get a top quality education. And if it turns out they're being deported, if they're arrested by masked federal agents simply for freedom of speech, I think we're going to lose that, geopolitical asset very, very quickly. In other words, there was another case, for example, of an Indian student who, when the police raided her building because of her criticism of Israel, she narrowly escaped being arrested, and she quickly fled to Canada because, I mean, she basically just packed a few things in a bag and fled to Canada for fear of being arrested by the police in the United States. And, again, I mean, these are the sorts of individuals, because they, ended up coming to the United States and attending our top universities, who are, who have tremendous influence in the countries that they came from. And we're talking about countries like Turkey, South Korea, India, very important countries that are mostly American allies. And I'd assume these stories are gigantic stories in the elites of those countries that are thinking of sending their children to American universities. And I think that is going to go into very sharp decline if hundreds of these students now are being rounded up by masked federal agents simply for speaking their mind or writing a piece to a school newspaper. I mean, not only that, but a lot of top American administrators have suffered in the same way. For example, as far as I know, there's never been a previous case in American history where the president of an Ivy League university was abruptly fired on a political issue. But in the last 12 months, 4 or 5 Ivy League presidents have been fired or forced to resign exactly for these questions because they permitted freedom of speech on their own campus. I mean, for example, 2 consecutive presidents of Columbia University have now been forced to resign over these political issues. And I mean, it's utterly bizarre. What America is doing is destroying one of America's greatest geopolitical assets, the strength of its global higher education system. We're just burning it to the ground. And I mean, that's something that, if you were a country that was hostile to the United States, this would be your dream would be for America to destroy its own geopolitical soft power, as we're doing right now. I mean, it's just utterly bizarre what we're doing. And I mean, we're doing it at the behest of a foreign country, the state of Israel. I mean, it's bizarre. When you see, for example, the fact that all but 1 or 2 of the members of Congress have pledged loyalty to a foreign country, the state of Israel. I mean, it's, when you talk about, as I mentioned in my article, in the last year or so, millions of dollars by Zionist billionaires have been spent to remove from office any member of Congress who was viewed as insufficiently loyal to a foreign country. I mean, that's not the sort of thing you see in political science textbooks, where elected officials in the United States are kept in office only if they're loyal to a foreign country. I mean, it's just utterly bizarre. And so I mean, it's something so strange that, if somebody would have told me a few years ago that this would be happening in American society, I never would have believed it. But, it's happening right now. And it's also, the precedent is being set. I mean, the fact that these masked federal agents are raiding the homes and rounding up these foreign students who were permanent residents of the United States, throwing them lockups without access to their lawyers or family members, and then deporting them or transferring them to a Louisiana, holding cell. I mean, that sets the precedent of their being able to do something very similar to American citizens. And in fact, if you look just a few years ago, you had the mass arrests of all the January 6th protesters. I mean, the January 6th protesters, in almost all cases, were guilty of nothing more than trespassing or perhaps petty vandalism. Yet they were arrested in mass groups. They were rounded up all across the country. They were hunted down and given very long prison sentences or kept in solitary confinement for periods of time. And that was simply because their political speech was massively demonized by the government authorities of the United States and by the media. And so, in the same way, if, for example, criticizing Israel becomes sufficiently demonized by the media and by the American government, I mean, it seems very clear that, I mean, American citizens, native born American citizens, could be treated exactly in the same way as these permanent residents of the United States are. I mean, we're talking about that South Korean girl. Her family came here when she was 7 years old. She's lived here almost her entire life. She was a valedictorian at a local school. She became a student at Columbia University, and suddenly she was rounded up, or they tried to round her up, but she went into hiding. I mean, when was the last time that peaceful individuals, not accused of any major crime, have been forced to go into hiding in the United States to escape being, seized by government authorities? It's just a very, very strange situation.
How were they able to find out about these op-eds of both these students?
Oh, there are various pro-Israel activist organizations that go around and look for the names of students who, have criticized Israel and then put them on their website. So, I mean, that's probably what happened. But, I mean, the op-ed is published. I mean, it was basically a Tufts University op-ed in the campus newspaper. I assume Tufts has a website, so anybody can go to their website and read the op-ed. I mean, it was published a year ago, and it's simply, I haven't read it, but as far as I know, what people say is there were 4 or 5 students that signed the op-ed, she being one of them, and they simply called for the administration of Tufts to respect the vote of the students on divesting from companies that do business with Israel or something along those lines. And so, I mean, when you think about it, it was, whatever, 10 or 20 years ago that there were all these protests in favor of divestiture from South Africa. Now, South Africa was an American ally at the time. And can you imagine what would have happened, what the media would have said if all these students protesting against South Africa or supporting divestiture from South Africa had been rounded up by masked government agents? I mean, it's utterly bizarre. I mean, the most hardened criminals in the United States, I mean, people who are accused of murder aren't treated in this sort of way. I mean, the Rosenbergs, they were foreign spies. They gave our nuclear weapons secrets to the communist Soviet Union, and they weren't treated in this way. It's just nothing like this has ever happened, as far as I know, in American history. And I mean, one reason I think nothing has ever happened is if anything like this had ever happened, it would have been in all my introductory history textbooks. And since it's never been covered in the textbooks, it never happened. I mean, it's utterly bizarre. I mean, for example, that video, there was a video clip somebody showed of like 6 masked federal agents seizing that 30-year-old young woman on the streets of Somerville and hustling her off to an unmarked car. I mean, that's the sort of thing that used to happen in the Soviet Union under Stalin. I mean, it's almost a stereotypical example of a dictatorial police state cracking down and arresting people who've simply spoken their mind or written an op-ed or something like that. I just, it's very, very rare, even in dictatorships today around the world or authoritarian regimes, that anything like that happens. For example, I can't remember the name of the guy who runs Venezuela right now. But I can't imagine that his government has ever done anything like that. Because if they had done it, it would be on all the media channels in the United States. We would be using it to condemn Venezuela for having basically seized this young woman simply for writing an op-ed in her student newspaper. I mean, just utterly bizarre.
Do you think we still have a First Amendment, Ron?
Well, we're having less and less of it every day. I mean, for example, you have all these people who are being fired from their jobs for speaking out. I mean, that's becoming more and more serious over the last few years. Then, I mean, you had, again, part of the Bill of Rights is the rights to peaceably assemble. And the January 6th protesters, I mean, again, some of them were involved in violence. Some of them were involved in, trespassing or basically vandalism. But I mean, we're talking about very, very mild offenses. I mean, probably 95% of the January 6th protesters, even the ones who went into the Capitol building, would have been guilty of nothing more than misdemeanors. And so, maybe they would have been fined $500 or given, 10 days in jail or something like that. But instead, some of them were sentenced to like 10 years in prison. They've all been pardoned now. But, basically they'd spent years in solitary confinement. And the right to peaceably assemble is part of the original Bill of Rights. And that's not the case if you peaceably assemble and protest over something that the authorities don't like. And that was a perfect example of all these protests over Gaza. Student protests on university campuses have been going on and part of student life for 30, 40, 50 years. I remember, there were protests when I was a student, when I was a college student. And nothing like this sort of crackdown has ever happened. For example, in the case of UCLA, gangs of thugs from outside the campus were paid to come in and beat up the protesters with iron bars. Dozens of protesters apparently were seriously injured. And then the police stood by and did nothing, and then arrested 200 of the peaceful protesters. It's just it's exactly the sort of thing you would see in Latin American dictatorships. For example, in a Latin American dictatorship, if some of the college students on a campus protest, the dictatorship, sometimes thugs are brought in from the outside to beat them up. And that's exactly what happened at UCLA. And that's exactly what's happened sometimes with police attacks on campuses all across the United States during those protests. But now, it's not even protest. For example, that young woman and these 200 or 300 people who've been arrested right now, or are being sought by the police, they weren't even protesting now. They were being tracked down for what they'd been involved in a year ago, or if they'd simply written an op-ed.
Oh, your audio lost your audio there for a second, Ron. Can you hear me? No, it's all muffled. You're
Can you hear me now?
now we're good. Yep.
Okay.
But just back up what you were saying.
Right. So I was just saying, we're talking about a young woman, 6 masked federal agents grabbing her off the street because she'd written an op-ed in her student newspaper a year ago that criticized the government of Israel. It's just bizarre.
And I don't think what people realize, and I find interesting about this, is January 6th, everybody, especially, it's pretty apparent, I think be apparent to you, I'm very much on the right? I lean on the right. And January 6th, everybody was like, got to get the January 6th people out, got to get the January 6th people out. They were, unlawfully jailed. To your point, there was some things that were done from a vandalism standpoint. But now, on the other side of this, as we talk about, speaking out against Israel, those same media heads that were speaking so much in, defending the January 6th and in advocating for them, I don't see any of that.
Oh, exactly. It's funny because some of these Trump officials, when they were running or, after they came into office, they said, we're firmly going to reestablish freedom of speech on college campuses. None of this diversity stuff, whatever it's called, the DEI, where students were being, severely punished simply for making remarks that, other people criticized or something like that. Again, it was sort of a reign of severe repression on all these college campuses, so that Trump and all the people around him came in saying, we are going to reestablish freedom of speech on college campuses. And the repression now is far worse than it was, except it's just targeting a different group. It's just utterly bizarre when you have people say what you will about the universities cracking down on free speech. As far as I know, nobody who criticized, for example, diversity policy in a student newspaper was arrested by 6 masked federal agents on the streets of his own city. That didn't happen. The person might be punished by the university, might even be expelled from the university, but you're not arrested by 6 masked federal agents. That's exactly the sort of thing we used to hear about. I don't know if it really happened. I don't know the details of, for example, how the Stalinist secret police used to arrest people. But, again, the notion of like mass agents, government agents from the Department of Homeland Security, grabbing somebody walking off the street, hustling them into an unmarked car, and taking them away with no one knowing what had happened to them for 24 hours. I mean, that is something out of a Hollywood movie.
And it's one thing if you're vandalizing, if you're breaking the law, and you're on a visa, that's a different story in my view. But for writing an op-ed, and Marco Rubio said this, if you're writing an op-ed, it's one thing to write an op-ed. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's if you're breaking the law and causing havoc of destruction, breaking windows or whatever. That's another thing. So it sounds like it's contradictory to what he even said.
He doesn't know anything. I mean, basically, he's just a puppet. I mean, in other words, it's sort of, to be honest, most of the politicians in the United States are just puppets. In other words, they take money from their donors and they do whatever their donors want them to do. I don't think for example, Marco Rubio, I doubt if he even knew the names of any of these people that he'd ordered rounded up and canceled the visas from. I mean, for example, the law that was used to deport some of these people or try to get them deported had never been used for this purpose. I think it was like a 1798 law from, more than 200 years ago. Again, it had never been applied to arguing that somebody's permanent residency status should be canceled simply because they wrote an op-ed. I mean, it's unheard of. Again, permanent residency gives somebody all of the rights and privileges of an American citizen. That's been the law for, since probably 100 or 150 years ago that the policy was established. Your permanent residency can be canceled if you commit a very serious felony, like murder, like rape, something along those lines. It's never been canceled for basically freedom of speech. And that's exactly what's going on right now. And I mean, again, it's so obvious that exactly these same provisions then will be used as a precedent to target American citizens who are doing the same thing. And again, it already happened with the January 6th protesters, though from the other ideological side. In other words, the laws applied to the January 6th protesters it was utterly ridiculous what they were charged with. I mean, just say that, for example, somebody who walks into a government building through an open door is guilty of insurrection and should be sent to prison for 10 years. And I mean, for example, the videos of their faces were used with software to track them down all across the United States. I mean, there was a massive effort to track them all down. And again, exactly the sort of thing now is going on with anybody who has been willing to criticize the government of Israel, a foreign government. Now, what's bizarre, and something that I pointed out in my op-ed, in my column, is, as far as I know, nobody has been threatened with deportation or arrest simply because they criticized the American government, or even if they criticized President Donald Trump. You can certainly criticize the American government. You can certainly criticize the President of the United States, Donald Trump. You're not allowed to criticize the foreign government of Israel. And, that I think shows you who really runs the United States.
And I think the other thing too for people to consider, as Ron has spoken for the last 30 minutes, this is where things start, and then the net widens and widens and widens. So you can't criticize, say, Israel today, but then eventually it might be you can't criticize the United States government, or you can't question why they're putting this policy in place. Because that's the one thing about the government is, once they put, measures in place, they don't take them away. And if anything, they just tighten it and tighten it and tighten it.
It's already happened to some people. Take, for example, someone like Scott Ritter. I think you may have even had him on your show once or twice.
I have, yeah.
I mean, he basically had criticized our policy towards Russia and our support for the Ukraine war. And I think it was 20 or 30 federal agents raided his home. They confiscated his passport. They confiscated all of his electronic equipment. And that was under the Biden administration, simply because he was critical of the Biden administration's policy towards Russia and towards Ukraine. I mean, I think it was like 25 federal agents ransacked his home. I mean, that's utterly bizarre. I mean, as far as I know, none of the Soviet spies of the 1950s ever suffered in that sort of way. I mean, basically, they were just arrested in the normal sort of way. I mean, having armed, helmeted federal agents raid somebody's home simply because he criticizes the government is not something that is part of the American tradition.
What does it matter what president is in or what administration? Would the same thing be occurring?
Well, I mean, there are differences here and there, but I mean, when you look at the continuity of policy, I mean, basically, we're still we're still supporting Ukraine. I mean, Trump had come in promising to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours. It's now been several months and nothing much has happened. I mean, he's still negotiating with the Russians. He's threatening the Russians. The Russians are not agreeing to the terms that he wants them to agree to. And as far as I know, the Ukraine war may go on for another year or so, or at least until the Ukrainians are defeated by the Russians. Meanwhile, our support for the state of Israel and its war on the other countries in the Middle East is just as strong as before. And Trump is making noises now about starting a new war with Iran. So, I mean, basically Trump came in promising to end all these wars. So far, none of these wars have ended. And we may even be starting a new one with Iran, which, would cause probably a massive spike in oil prices. I mean, we'd be talking about probably $10 a gallon gasoline. I mean, it's just a crazy thing that we're doing. And, clearly part of it is because Sheldon Adelson's wife, Miriam, gave Trump $100 million. I mean, when you give somebody $100 million for their political campaign, you sort of basically want them to do what you're paying them to do. And that's exactly what's going on. I mean, it's just, to have all of these politicians under the political control of their donors is really, a very, very unfortunate thing for the United States. In fact, do you know who Thomas Massey is? He's sort of one of the really almost one of the only honest members of Congress. And when he was on the Tucker Carlson show a few months ago, maybe it was 6, 8 months ago, he revealed that every member of Congress, with the exception of he himself, has an AIPAC handler. In other words, has a handler from AIPAC that tells them what to do and how to vote. And that's because all of these individuals get money from the donors that support AIPAC and the ADL and all these other organizations. So, again, I mean, if these are the people paying all these politicians and sometimes then giving them money under the table for their personal bank accounts, I mean, that's what they do. They basically do what their donors tell them to do. I mean, it's just a very, very bad situation when our elected officials are required to be more loyal to a foreign government than they are to the United States. I mean, a country that is run that way is in for very difficult times.
I want to talk about your article from last week with John F. Kennedy, but before that, do you think this Middle East, what's occurring now, will escalate to that threshold, crossing the threshold with Iran?
Well, it might. I mean, certainly, Donald Trump is certainly making a lot of very strong threats, saying that the Iranians have to disarm, that they have to give up their nuclear development program and everything like that. And, again, it's a question of whether he's simply threatening or whether he'll follow through on it. But I mean, we have moved, I think, a couple of our aircraft carriers into the region, along with some of our most advanced bombers. Our stealth bombers that are nuclear capable have been positioned on Diego Garcia so that they could attack Iran. And Trump has been threatening them, so it's certainly very possible. And, again, if there's a war with Iran, there's a very good chance the Iranians obviously would have their country devastated if we attacked them all out. But on the other hand, they would be able to retaliate with their missiles, including hypersonic missiles, and possibly sink a U.S. aircraft carrier or two, and certainly destroy all of our land bases. And probably if, for example, any of these Arab countries like Saudi Arabia or the other Gulf states allowed overfly of American aircraft, probably the Iranians would attack and retaliate against their oil facilities. They would cut off the Persian Gulf. And so, we would see oil prices go to tremendous heights, probably higher than they've ever been before, and gasoline go to $6, $7, $8, $10 a gallon. And that's even if the Russians did not get involved, and it's quite possible that they would get involved. So it certainly would be a disaster, and I would certainly hope that some of the more responsible members of the Trump administration will avoid that happening. But, that's sort of what Trump is threatening right now. So I really can't say about that, but I mean, it's a very dangerous situation for the world, certainly.
So you wrote a piece last week in regards to John F. Kennedy, and what I want to ask you is, because all the files were released, what were your expectations when they announced they were going to release the files?
Well, I expected there would be nothing interesting in any of the files. In other words, I mean, the truth is, I'm not aware of anything new that came out in the files. In other words, the revelations that people found simply confirm what had been well known for 20 or 30 or 35 years. To give an example, one of the pieces that circulated very widely was that James Angleton, the head of counterintelligence at the CIA, was very, very close to the Israeli Mossad and had apparently been involved in giving some of our nuclear weapon secrets to the Israeli government to help the nuclear weapons development program. So it was confirmed in these released documents. But for example, Seymour Hersh had published it in a book 25 or 30 years ago. There was a Washington Post article that said the same thing 37 years ago. So in other words, it's certainly nice to have these facts confirmed by official government documents, but they were very well known to researchers and had been well known for decades. Also, it is possible that with the 60,000 pages of documents released, once researchers go through those documents very, very carefully over the next 6 months or year or a couple of years, it's possible that they may be able to connect a few dots together and come up with some new discoveries, some new aspects of the case. But as far as I know, I mean, there were no revelations that were anything new to people who've simply been reading books and articles by, very informed, very knowledgeable individuals such as Seymour Hersh.
And you mentioned in your article too, at one point, you didn't think there were any ties from JFK to Israel. Am I understanding that correctly?
Not really. I mean, to be honest, I'd never really paid any attention to the JFK assassination until about 12 years ago. I'd been naive enough to simply believe it was a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, who went crazy or was a communist or something like that and killed JFK. So I was very naive about it, and I simply never believed there was any sort of conspiracy until I guess by now it might be closer to 15 years ago. So it was until 12 or 15 years ago I never suspected anything. But once I started looking into the issue and reading books on it by very knowledgeable scholars, it became very clear that there had been a conspiracy behind JFK's assassination. So that's the first thing. In other words, there's now absolutely overwhelming evidence, and has been for decades, that JFK was not assassinated by a deranged lone gunman, that he was killed by an organized conspiracy. In fact, his brother Robert Kennedy and many, many other top government officials were sure of it almost from the beginning, almost from the moment it happened, but they couldn't prove anything. So we're talking about a near certainty that he was killed by a conspiracy. And then the issue becomes, and what people have been arguing over for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, who was involved in the conspiracy and what were the motives? And it seems very clear once I started investigating the issue carefully, reading a dozen or 15 books by the leading experts, doing some thinking, comparing these issues together, it was very clear that the Israeli Mossad played a central role in the JFK assassination. In other words, Israel was very heavily involved in the JFK assassination. They weren't the only individuals involved, but they probably were the central force involved in JFK's elimination. And the reason they assassinated JFK, and they also probably assassinated his brother Robert Kennedy a few years later, was because Kennedy had been in an all-out political battle with the state of Israel over Israel's nuclear weapons development program. Kennedy was very strongly committed to nuclear non-proliferation, and he was outraged that the Israelis were lying about the effort they were making to develop nuclear weapons. In other words, they were covering it up. So he was putting enormous pressure on the government of Israel to eliminate, to halt their nuclear weapons development program. and to allow inspections of international experts to prove that they weren't really developing nuclear weapons as they'd been claiming. So that was one of the issues. The other issue was that John Kennedy and his brother Robert, who was the Attorney General, were making a major effort to break the power of the Israel lobby in the United States, to force AIPAC, or rather the organization that became AIPAC, AIPAC's predecessor, to register as a foreign agent. Now, if AIPAC were an official foreign agent of the Israeli government, its power would be enormously diminished because it would be under all sorts of restrictions, and individuals would not be allowed to take money from AIPAC because it would be basically an agent of a foreign government. So at that point, AIPAC, the AIPAC equivalent back in the early 1960s, had a tiny, tiny fraction of the power that AIPAC has today. But it still was a very important organization and growing rapidly. And what outraged Kennedy is when he was running for the presidency, he held a meeting with a number of pro-Israel Jewish billionaires, or actually they were multimillionaires back then. The country was less wealthy. And they offered to fund his entire presidential campaign if he agreed to give them control over our Middle Eastern policy, so that our Middle Eastern policy would be in the hands of Israel's agents. And he sort of, fobbed them off. He said, I support Israel. He sort of just tried to, get out of that meeting without making any firm commitment. But he was outraged over the fact that there was a chance American foreign policy would fall into the hands of a foreign government. So the next morning, he ended up he met with one of his closest friends in D.C., one of the journalists, and told him that if he ended up getting into the presidency, he would ensure that the power of this AIPAC organization was destroyed. And that's exactly what he did once he went into the White House. He and his brother Robert were making efforts to break the power of the Israel lobby. So the combination of Israel's nuclear weapons development program, which was illegal at the time, and America was trying to block through the Kennedy administration, and Kennedy's attempt to severely diminish the power of the Israel lobby, were very strong motives for Kennedy's elimination. And so, again, there we're simply talking about motives. There are other factors. Obviously, when you're talking about a crime, you're talking about means, motive, and opportunity. And all those other factors fall into place. Now, one thing I should emphasize is Mossad was not the only organization involved. But one reason, for example, it's quite likely that they would have been involved is Mossad has also tried to assassinate previous American presidents, other American presidents. For example, the early Zionists tried to assassinate Harry Truman. They tried to assassinate the government of Britain. They did assassinate some top British officials and assassinate the UN peace negotiator. And in fact, a Mossad defector later claimed that Mossad planned the assassination of President George H.W. Bush because he was refusing to support some of the loan provisions for West Bank settlements. So Mossad tried to organize the assassination of President Bush. And in fact, apparently President Obama was very fearful of, being assassinated by Mossad, or at least that's what he told some of the people around him. He was very nervous at one point when he was in a political battle with Israel over that issue. So in other words, for example, if you take the book by Ronan Bergman, a very authoritative 700-page history of Mossad assassinations that came out a few years ago, he was endorsed by, several previous Mossad directors. They gave him open access to all the files and everything like that. Now, obviously, he didn't put in the cases of these assassination attempts or assassinations against top American officials. But the information that he did put in about all the government leaders around the world who've been assassinated, or at least assassination attempts have been made by Assad, Mossad has basically committed more assassinations, international assassinations than every other secret organization in the world combined, more than the CIA, the KGB, and 10 other organizations combined. So in other words, they certainly would be a plausible candidate for having been involved in the JFK assassination. Then when you're looking at the details of the plot, if we believe that there was a conspiracy, the question is, who were the conspirators? The one person, if there were a conspiracy to kill JFK, the one individual who was absolutely certain to be part of that conspiracy was Jack Ruby, because he was the individual who then killed Lee Harvey Oswald and shut his mouth when Oswald said he was innocent and was simply a patsy for the crime. Ruby killed him. Now, Ruby was somebody who'd been very heavily involved in organized crime, but the Jewish pro-Israel wing of organized crime. He was very close to some of the Jewish gangsters who were strongly supportive of Israel and in fact had been involved in some of the nuclear smuggling efforts to get nuclear materials to Israel. So in other words, we're talking about Jack Ruby being very closely involved with individuals who were very tight with the state of Israel. And in fact, Ruby, after he was arrested and imprisoned, told his rabbi that he shot Oswald for the Jews. He did it for the Jews. Now, that can have a number of different meanings, but one plausible meaning was that he killed Oswald to shut his mouth so that, the conspiracy involving Mossad would not come to light. Another individual who almost certainly was involved in the assassination conspiracy was Vice President Lyndon Johnson. I mean, obviously, when a president is killed and his vice president suddenly takes office, I mean, he's the most obvious candidate to look at. And in fact, I was really, one thing that shocked me when I started reading these JFK conspiracy books was that almost nobody mentioned Johnson's name. Now, it turns out some of the conspirators actually said that they had Johnson's approval when they were later interviewed and there were some wiretaps of some of their discussion. They claimed that Johnson had been involved in the plot, but for example, none of these JFK conspiracy writers were willing to point to Johnson because the notion of Johnson being involved was simply too horrifying from the American point of view to possibly continents. But when you look at it, one thing that came out about 10 or 15 years later was that Johnson was about to be destroyed by the Kennedy brothers. In other words, Johnson and Kennedy hated each other. They'd been bitter rivals. And the Kennedys had planned to eliminate Johnson from the ticket, drop him from the ticket, have the media run a huge expose on Johnson's severe corruption and other crimes in the state of Texas, and send Johnson to prison. So in other words, the Kennedy brothers were planning to destroy Johnson. And in fact, Life magazine, one of the most important publications in the United States, had already, under the influence of the Kennedys, had produced a massive expose of Johnson's crimes and corruption back home in Texas. And the article had already been written. It was scheduled to be run in the next issue or two of Life magazine. And the Kennedys then would have used it to drop Johnson from the ticket and probably have him sent to prison. And instead, Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson became president immediately afterward. And at that point, Life magazine then realized which way the wind was blowing, and they destroyed all copies of the article that they'd written. So in other words, Johnson had a very strong motive for striking against Kennedy because otherwise he would have been destroyed. He would have been sent to prison. And there are some very interesting facts about Johnson's background and his involvement in the conspiracy. For example, Johnson was an enormously corrupt individual. He was probably the most corrupt president we've ever had. He basically came from a dirt poor background. He had never had any money in his life. He spent his entire career at very low paid political jobs. And when he became president of the United States, he was one of the wealthiest presidents in American history. He had the equivalent of $100 million fortune. That's because he'd used his wife's business to launder all the massive bribes he took from the businesses that needed favors from him in Texas and around the country. He was a massively corrupt individual. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that he'd been involved in several murders of government officials and of people who, threatened to reveal some of his corruption schemes. And so the fact that he'd be involved in an attempt to assassinate Kennedy to save his own career, to save himself from prison, would not be at all surprising. One of the shocking things that came out eventually by some of these researchers was that Johnson had sort of a chief, somebody who's really regarded as Johnson's personal hitman, a guy named Mac Wallace, who's widely believed of having been involved in some of the political killings that Johnson required. Wallace's fingerprint decades later was found. One of the fingerprints that had been on the in the book depository building where Oswald was allegedly stationed, where he allegedly shot Kennedy. One of the fingerprints found had never been identified. And decades later, it was identified as the fingerprint of Johnson's henchman, Mac Wallace. So, it's possible that Wallace had been one of the shooters, but more likely that Wallace had just been delegated to set up the sniper's nest to sort of, put the bullets there or whatever that were used to blame Oswald. Another shocking thing is that as, Lyndon Johnson was in one of the cars right behind Kennedy as, they moved into the Dallas area where Kennedy was ultimately shot. Now, Johnson was obviously part of the plot, but still, when you know that there's a sniper about to shoot the president of the United States, you're obviously very nervous yourself if the vice president. I mean, what if basically they've decided to eliminate you as well, to shut your mouth? And so it turns out at the sound of the first bullet, Johnson immediately ducked down before anybody else in his car. Johnson had been making efforts to try to find an excuse to duck down in the car before any bullets were fired. And once the first shot was fired, he reacted before anybody else did in any of the cars. And so that, I think, is almost smoking gun evidence of Johnson's involvement. So we're talking about motive, means, and opportunity. Johnson also controlled Dallas. He controlled the city of Dallas politically. So it was much, much easier for him to arrange, obviously, for Oswald to be shot, for all of these other steps to be taken, making it easier for Kennedy to be assassinated. And another thing that I actually hadn't even realized until I went back and reread some of the stuff. The fake autopsy that covered up the fact that there were multiple gunshots that had hit Kennedy was performed by naval surgeons. It was under the control of the Navy in the United States, which is a little bit strange. In other words, why would the Navy be involved? It turns out Johnson, as part of his deal with the Kennedys, had installed one of his cronies as Secretary of the Navy. So Johnson had a tremendous amount of direct influence over naval personnel and what would do. And then Johnson obviously arranged the Warren Commission cover-up that, then basically said a lone gunman had been involved. One more individual I should mention is, again, James Angleton, the longtime head of counterintelligence at the CIA, one of the top CIA officials. Somebody named John Newman, who's not that well known, but he really should be. Newman had spent 20 years in government intelligence. He'd been at the Defense Intelligence Agency for 20 years. He then retired and became a history professor, I think, at the University of Maryland. He then has used his extremely effective skills, intelligence skills, to go through and analyze all these declassified government documents over the last 30 or 40 years, weave them together. And when he analyzed the declassified CIA government documents, he ended up confirming the fact that the individual at the CIA who clearly was part of the JFK assassination conspiracy was James Angleton. In other words, for years, there's been a widespread belief, and probably a correct belief, that members of the CIA were involved in the Kennedy assassination conspiracy. And there have been a lot of arguments over who was involved. A lot of people, for example, have blamed Allen Dulles, the former director of the CIA, who Kennedy had fired after the Bay of Pigs. Other CIA names have come up, and some of them might have been involved. But the one individual who seems to be almost certainly have been involved at a very high level was Angleton. Angleton was also the member of the CIA who was closest to the Israeli Mossad. And as I said, it's now been proven that he gave nuclear weapons development secrets to the Israelis to help their program along. So he would have been exactly the sort of individual at the CIA who, as well as some, much lower level CIA agents, could have been involved in the conspiracy and basically working with Johnson and working with the Israeli Mossad, would have ended up killing our president. Now, the whole thing about in my article, one thing I also emphasized, a lot of people separate the two Kennedy assassinations. They talk about the Kennedy assassination, and by that they mean John F. Kennedy. Obviously, he was the president of the United States. It was a much higher profile case. But then his brother, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated 5 years later when he was running for the presidency himself. One reason in almost my entire life, until a dozen years or 15 years ago, I'd never suspected there was any conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination, is I said to myself, oh, this is ridiculous. Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's own brother, was Attorney General. He was the highest law enforcement official in the country. If there'd been the slightest hint of any possible conspiracy, Robert Kennedy obviously would have tracked it down. What I failed, and instead I firmly believed that Robert Kennedy had said that there was no conspiracy involved. There was a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. What I didn't realize at the time, and what, actually David Talbot's book that came out about, I think it was about 15 or 20 years ago, proved, was that Robert Kennedy from the first moment believed that his brother had been killed in a conspiracy. He wasn't exactly sure who the conspirators were, who was involved, what the motives were, but from the beginning he immediately believed it was a conspiracy. But the problem is, once Johnson became president, all of Robert Kennedy's power was eliminated. He had no authority anymore. For example, he'd been on very bad terms with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, and the Kennedys had been planning to fire J. Edgar Hoover after Kennedy's reelection. They just had very bad relations with him. So Hoover, and there's no evidence that Hoover was involved in the conspiracy, though, it's possibly might have been. Hoover was an enemy of the Kennedys. And so the moment that the president suddenly became Lyndon Johnson, who was a bitter enemy of Robert Kennedy, Hoover paid no attention to any of Kennedy's requests after that. So, Kennedy was the attorney general, but he had absolutely no power to track down any of the clues or any of the conspirators. What Kennedy then told all of his friends, and he couldn't even accuse anybody because, it would look like, it was a crazy thing unless he had some proof or some evidence. So what Kennedy always told his friends, many of them over the years, was he would wait until he himself could run for president. Once he himself were in the White House, he would then have the power to track down and punish the individuals who'd killed his brother. And that was why Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. He had just won the winner-take-all California primary. He was on an easy path to the nomination, the Democratic nomination. And given the martyrdom of his brother a few years ago and his own popularity, there's a very good chance he would have been elected president. And one of the first things he would have done would be to have a close investigation of who'd been involved, who had killed his brother, and he would bring them to justice. And that obviously was something the conspirators could not allow. So that was the reason he was killed. Now, what makes the Robert Kennedy assassination so interesting, and why it's important to connect it to the John F. Kennedy assassination, is, there's a huge amount of evidence that John F. Kennedy was killed by conspiracy. But it's the sort of evidence that takes a while to explain to people. In other words, you have to demonstrate it, you have to go through all these details, you have to read articles, you have to read books, and, people basically don't want to look at any of that stuff. They say, oh, I don't believe that. In the case of Robert Kennedy, it's hard physical evidence. The coroner's report, the LA official coroner's report, showed that Robert Kennedy was killed by a gunshot wound to the back of the head at point-blank range, within an inch or two of his head. Sirhan Sirhan, the accused gunman, was standing 6 or 7 feet in front of them. There's no way Sirhan Sirhan could have fired the fatal shot. There are audio tapes showing that at least 12 bullets were fired during the shooting. Sirhan's gun only held 8 rounds. and he certainly never had a chance to reload. Sirhan was simply a patsy, somebody used to distract people, while the actual gunman ended up shooting Kennedy from behind. In fact, people know pretty well who it was. For example, there was a security guard who was standing right behind Kennedy and was seen to be holding a gun in his hand. And it turns out that security guard, that temporary security guard, was somebody who was known to have a bitter personal hatred of the Kennedys. So I think it's very likely he was the guy. In other words, he basically was standing right behind Kennedy while Sirhan distracted everybody by firing those wild shots. He then shot Kennedy point blank range in the back of the head. And that's what happened. So, in other words, in the case of the Robert Kennedy assassination, we have the official coroner's report, we have an audio tape, we have the number of bullets being fired, we have all of this hard physical evidence that he was killed by a conspiracy. And here's one of the interesting things that again ties in with the Israeli Mossad. Sirhan was the patsy. In other words, even before a lot of this evidence came out for years, Sirhan said he had no memory of the shooting. And people at the time, very quickly afterwards, said he seemed to act as if he were in some sort of trance. There's a lot of evidence he was under hypnosis or trance. In other words, that's the sort of thing that can get you, if you're the right sort of subject, to go in and sort of shoot a gun in the general direction of somebody. In other words, it's not something that can probably make you an effective assassin, but it can probably make you a reasonably effective distraction, a patsy, somebody who shoots a few wild bullets so that everybody's looking in that direction while the actual killer strikes. Now, the interesting thing about it is, first of all, we're talking about the patsy being selected to be a Palestinian. Now, if you have a choice of patsy in this assassination attempt, and you pick a Palestinian, and you claim that he did it because of Robert Kennedy's pro-Israel policy, I mean, that certainly points in a certain direction, but there's something even more shocking that came out. Ronan Bergman, as I said, he wrote the definitive history of Mossad assassinations. And one of the assassination plots that Mossad had was to basically select a young Palestinian, use hypnosis and conditioning to turn him into a hypnotized killer who would then be released to assassinate Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader. And that's exactly what they did. They used rounds of hypnosis and conditioning to create somebody who they hoped then would assassinate Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO. And it didn't work out. The plot didn't go properly. But basically, at the same time, that young Palestinian was being hypnotized and conditioned to assassinate Yasser Arafat by Mossad. That's the exact moment when Sirhan was firing his shots and being wrestled to the ground in the Roosevelt Hotel in LA. So in other words, we're talking about two Palestinians both being hypnotized and conditioned to become assassins. One of them by the Mossad, and the other one at the same time done by who knows who. And the fact that Mossad was doing exactly that same thing to a young Palestinian, when all this happened, certainly raises the likelihood that they were very much involved in the RFK assassination plot. So I mean, we're talking about all of the different pieces. Now, if you read any of the JFK assassination books, I mean, there's a gigantic amount of supporting evidence aside from these things I mentioned. But I mean, these are sort of the things that jumped out on me the most. The interesting thing about it, for the first few decades after the Kennedy assassination, nobody remotely suspected that Israel had anything involved in the plot. In other words, Kennedy received 80% of the Jewish vote in the United States. Many of his strong supporters were American Jews. Many of the people involved in breaking open the original conspiracy came from a Jewish background. They wrote the original conspiracy books. Nobody ever suspected the Israeli Mossad had been involved, because also there was no motive. Why would the Israelis want to kill Kennedy when Kennedy was viewed as so pro-Israel, along with other politicians? And then in the very early 1990s, suddenly books came out on the secret Israeli nuclear weapons program and on the massive efforts and political pressure that Kennedy was making to stop that program in its tracks and prevent it from going ahead. And that suddenly provided the first example of a motive. And at that point, somebody named Michael Collins Piper, a journalist at a publication called The Spotlight in DC, suddenly put two and two together. And he was the first person who came out with the idea that the Israeli Mossad might have been involved. And once he started going through all of these dozens or even hundreds of JFK conspiracy books that had already been written, going through all the details, finding the pieces that pointed towards Israel and the Mossad, all of it came together. And he published his book almost exactly 30 years ago. I think it was late 1994. The interesting thing I discovered as I found out about that book, and the book ended up becoming an underground bestseller. It sold 40,000 copies. Virtually everybody in the JFK conspiracy theory community certainly became aware of it, but nobody would dare mention it. None of the books, none of the Kennedy conspiracy books I ended up reading ever even acknowledged the existence of that book. I mean, for example, some of these books I read, they might have had a bibliography with 200 separate books listed. That book was never listed. Nobody would even mention his name. Nobody, it never appeared anywhere. And he still ended up selling 40,000 copies because the idea was so explosive. And then more recently, a few other people have taken up the same, issue. But I mean, it shows how incredibly radioactive it was to even suggest that the Israelis had been involved. But when you look at the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. I mean, just to get back to the whole issue of motive, when you believe that there was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, one argument people have always made on the other side, who say there couldn't have been a conspiracy, is, we're talking about a major organized plot. Yet when you look at Johnson's policies, on all issues, they were a direct continuation of the Kennedy policies. In other words, Kennedy had started the Vietnam War, Johnson continued it. Kennedy had tried to pass civil rights legislation, Johnson succeeded. All Johnson did was to take a lot of the bills that Kennedy had supported and introduced and simply get them passed through Congress. Johnson kept on nearly all of Kennedy's top advisors and top officials. So, I mean, why would anybody want to kill Kennedy if all they would get would be exactly the same policies under Lyndon Johnson? Now, obviously, that explains why Johnson would have wanted to kill Kennedy, since Johnson was about to be destroyed by the Kennedys. But if we're talking about somebody other than Johnson, there seemed no possible motive for any sort of involvement. In other words, Kennedy did not invade Cuba. Johnson didn't invade Cuba. Kennedy basically tried, there's a complete continuity of policy. The one area where American policy underwent a complete reversal, a 180-degree reversal, was our policy with regards to the state of Israel, Israel's nuclear weapons program, and the Israel lobby in the United States. Because Johnson was regarded as the American political leader closest to the state of Israel. In fact, a few years earlier, during the 1950s, Johnson had been the most powerful Democrat in America. He was the master of the Senate, it's called. He was the Senate majority leader. He totally controlled the Senate and even dominated the House. He was regarded as the number one supporter of Israel in the United States. And in fact, when President Eisenhower, during the 1950s, tried to put forth more of an even-handed Middle Eastern policy between Israel and the Arab states, Johnson fought him tooth and nail over that. So Johnson was the strongest supporter of Israel in the United States. And once he became president, all our policies reversed. And if you look at, for example, the Liberty incident a few years later, Johnson covered up the fact that the government of Israel had attacked an American ship and killed and wounded more than 200 American servicemen. It was totally covered up by the Johnson administration. And needless to say, if somebody like Kennedy had been in office, things would have been very different at that point. So we're talking about a president who was breaking the power of the Israel lobby in the United States and was fighting a tremendously bitter political battle with Israel over Israel's nuclear weapons program, being suddenly assassinated and replaced by the most pro-Israel politician in America. And that, I think, explains exactly what happened with the Kennedy administration and its assassination.
I know we went over time, but one thing I want to ask you, I think, pretty quick question. What are your thoughts on Robert Kennedy Jr.?
Oh, well, I mean, until about 5 or 6 years ago, I really barely even known who he was. In other words, I sort of knew he was involved in some environmental projects. And I knew also he was involved in anti-vaccine efforts and that sort of thing. But until I guess it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, I barely even knew who he was. But then, for example, when he came out with his book, the book about Fauci, I really dismissed it. In other words, I thought, oh, just some book. But then somebody persuaded me to read it, and I was incredibly impressed by it. Incredibly impressed. And then around the same time, he came out with an op-ed publicly declaring that Sirhan, the alleged killer of his father, was completely innocent and was a patsy and should be released from prison. So, in other words, it's one thing if I say Sirhan didn't kill Robert Kennedy and was a patsy. But when Robert Kennedy's own son says it and says that he should be released from prison, that carried a lot of weight with people. And so I was very impressed by that. And I was very impressed by his public statements and efforts to reopen the John F. Kennedy assassination. And for example, when he went on the Tucker Carlson show, I was very impressed by him as well. And to be honest, I probably, when he was thinking of running as an independent, I probably would have voted for him. But I was very disappointed that, he came out so strongly pro-Israel on the Gaza conflict. And now he's basically done exactly that. And in fact, it's really, I realize he's in a very difficult position right now. Probably personally, he may be under a lot of pressure. But for example, one of his ultra pro-Israel supporters, that Rabbi Shmuley or something like that, he was at a campaign event with Shmuley. And Shmuley denounced Sirhan as being the Palestinian who killed Robert Kennedy's father. And Robert Kennedy knew perfectly well it wasn't true. Robert Kennedy was the one who declared him innocent. And Kennedy just sort of stood there without opening his mouth and just refused to say anything. So, obviously, I generally support a lot of the things that Kennedy is now doing. I don't support all of Kennedy's public health policies, but I certainly support a lot of them. And so, I'll have to see how things evolve. But, I'd say certainly he has the opportunity to certainly improve American public health dramatically. And once I started looking into some of the issues that he raised and some of the issues that his organization raised, which I never even paid any attention to, I think he might be very much on the right track regarding some of these nutritional issues. I'm certainly not an expert, but now that I've read a few books on them, I think he might be very much, on the right track. So, if he takes some of those steps as head of HHS, I think he could, have a tremendously positive impact on the public health of the United States. But I am very disappointed on some of his public statements regarding Israel and some of his public statements, regarding, the fate of his own father and things like that. But, it's not for me to say, the dangers he's under right now. I mean, when you think about it, if his uncle was assassinated and his father was assassinated, and a number of other Kennedys have died under suspicious circumstances, like his cousin John F. Kennedy Jr. died in that plane crash when he was thinking of running for office. I mean, he also has children, he has a family. He may be under a lot of personal pressure that, other people may not face. And, that may explain some of his public statements. So, I don't want to really condemn him for those.
Last question. As we sat here and chatted, we've spoken for over an hour. What do you think the state of our country is?
Well, it's in a very bad state right now. And to be honest, I mean, just since the last time we talked, a few months ago, I mean, the fact that we're now possibly very close to war with Iran, at least if you take Trump's statements at face value, the fact that masked agents of the government are grabbing people off the streets simply because they published an op-ed in their student newspaper. I mean, nothing like that has ever happened in American history before. And that's a very, very bad situation to be in. And I mean, we look at, for example, the decline in the stock market, the fact that inflation is still high. I mean, a lot of people are very concerned that there might be a stock market and a financial collapse in the United States, with these different pressures. So, all I can say is the state of the America right now is not very good in a lot of different ways.
Where can people find you, Ron?
It's the UNS review, uns.com. And again, it's very easy to see my own articles. So one thing I'd like to emphasize is I certainly don't stand behind, I don't take responsibility for all the things published on our website. We publish right-wing articles, left-wing articles, conspiracy articles, racialist articles, libertarian articles. We publish all the sorts of things that the mainstream media won't go near. But I do stand behind everything I myself have written. And some of my articles have probably been among the most controversial on the website.
Ron, as always, thank you for taking time. I look forward to continuing to follow your work and more conversations ahead.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Mic drop.